Welcome to GRN, the Growth and Resilience Network, where every episode brings you targeted stories and strategies about professional and personal growth and resilience. The intent of each episode is to educate, energize, and equip you with information and hopefully a bit of wisdom to apply in your life and within your community. Hi, I'm Steve Piscitelli, your host. I'm coming to you from my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida. Now, today we're going to take a different perspective as we look at resilience and its relationship to climate. But what does climate resilience mean? Now, you probably ask 50 climate change specialists and you're going to get 50 different answers. But my guest today has a unique perspective on resilience and that of global environment, climate resilience. Mr. Adam Hoyles. Tell you a little bit about him, then we'll get into the meat of this. He has a wildlife ecology degree from the University of Florida. He is a practicing scientist in the area of environmental consulting. He is the vice president of operations for On-Site Environmental Consulting. You can find out more about Adam and his firm at onsiteec.com. And their services include studies about threatened, endangered, and special concerned species, wetland mitigation. And one of the things as I was looking through the website, Adam, that I really loved seeing was that you have one of your most critical skills is you bring people to the table and you serve as a facilitator in and with a topic that many times sees and hears a lot more of collective monologues than we do of actual dialogues. And then a side note, a personal note. Adam was a student of mine very early in my teaching career. He's one of the people that broke me in as a teacher. And he was also one of those students where I think I was smart enough to just stay the heck out of his way and let him grow. So, Adam, welcome, my friend, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, this is a blast. Let's just start off with a quick, as quick as it can be. We talk about climate change, and it raises temperatures, not just planetary, but in discussions. What is it? What does that mean?
Firstly, most people confuse it with weather. Whether it's what's going on today or this week or this month.
Okay.
Climate is basically the regional average. It's the tendency of an area.
Okay.
When we talk about climate change, we're talking about that average for an area shifting one way or the other. And the reason why we don't use global warming so much as a term as we use climate change is because the reality is some areas are warmer and some areas are colder.
Right.
And so that's a way of clarifying that. It's like, well, why is the weather and the climate in my area colder? Well, that's because climate change will cause some areas to be warmer and some areas to be colder, but the average, the overall average is warmer.
All right. So, and that's I think that's a great point because we hear sometimes we do hear global warming, and what you're setting for us is climate change is more than global warming. It can be global cooling.
Could be in some areas, but the overall average is that it is getting warmer.
Okay. Now, why should we care?
Excellent question.
Why should, I mean, you and I have had a conversation before about this, a few conversations, and you told me at one time, paraphrasing, but that the environment's going to survive. We won't if we stay on our current trajectory from the scientific point of view, that we go through cyclical changes. So why should we care?
The speed.
The
speed matters. A lot of I've heard people make the argument, well, climate has changed over millions of years and blah, 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 blah. You know, we've had a lot of different weather patterns in different areas of the world. We've had, ice ages, we've had warm periods. What's the big deal? Mm-hmm. The big deal is that, everybody's heard of massive extinctions. As a result of like an asteroid hitting the Earth or something like that. And people get this vision that it was an asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs and killed 85% of all species on the planet. And that's just not the case. What killed 85% of the species on the planet was that the climate changed very rapidly. What caused it was the asteroid, which meant that it was basically almost instantaneous, and it created a cascade of effects, and the creatures that were impacted by this were not able to adapt to that rapid change. Okay, so you fast forward to what's going on now. It's not an asteroid that's changing the climate. It's not the sun that's changing the climate. It's not the orbital period of the Earth. And
that's not
it.
They're not even factors?
Not significant factors.
Okay.
Okay. The most significant factor is that we are changing the chemistry of our atmosphere. And the Earth has always had a carbon budget. There used to be a lot more carbon in our atmosphere, and that's...
Stop you for a second. For the lay people like me, carbon budget.
Carbon budget. Where do you think all of the fossil fuel comes from? Comes from the ground.
Okay.
How did it get there? Originally, that was in the environment, and it was being consumed and used by trees and creatures and fish, and it was the world was a much warmer place. It was much more tropical at that point. That carbon got sequestered, sort of another term, but it got sequestered through sediments and geologic processes, and it's now part of the Earth, a part of the geology, and it takes the form of coal, limestone, calcium carbonate. That's also the carbonate part of that is a form of carbon that's now in rock. And what we are doing is very rapidly re-releasing that to the atmosphere. That's not a tragedy for the Earth, but it might be a problem if you're a human being trying to live on that Earth.
And when you say it's not a tragedy for the Earth, is that because the Earth adapts?
Well, the Earth changes, and it always has. But if you're a human being and you grow your food in a particular region of, let's say, the United States to keep it local, you think of the Midwest and where our bread basket is and where a lot of our corn and soybeans and wheat and the major staple crops of this country are. What's happening now is that region, and why it matters to us in Jacksonville is because a lot of our food is not actually grown in Jacksonville, but that region of the world is now shifting north. It's shifting north into Dakotas and into Canada. Well, that's awesome as long as you have more of that similar habitat and you have good relationships with North Dakota and Canada.
Right.
So
Okay.
Is that a tragedy for us? Well, no, it's just changing things. It can be a real serious tragedy, though, in other areas of the world. When those growth zones change, all of a sudden your traditional reliable sources of food changes.
And that could have can that have an impact then if the growth zones are moving northward? Have an impact on jobs?
Absolutely. Because those economies, those agricultural economies will shift. A lot of people, you're hearing, I don't want to get into all the politics of what's going on now, but there's this sort of concept that it's sort of a myth or it doesn't affect us. And the United States military some time ago decided by deduction that the greatest threat this country faces in terms of security is climate change and the instability that creates in nations that are not as resilient as ours is. One of the great things that America has the advantage of is we have a large area, we have a lot of diverse resources, and if our major agricultural areas shift a little bit over time, people aren't starving to death in Jacksonville. It doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us. It just means that our system is large enough and resilient enough to withstand that change.
All right, let's see if we can look at a specific example. And I think, again, if my memory serves me right from prior conversations with you, you brought up the issue of Hurricane Katrina.
Yes.
How does that give us some sort of a case study about climate change? Does it play into climate change? And then recently in our area here in northeast Florida, we had Hurricane Matthew come through. And I'm sure you'll probably touch on that because our dunes just they did what they were supposed to.
Yeah, but they're not here.
They're not here anymore.
Yeah.
They're gone.
Yeah.
They're absolutely gone.
Yes.
So can you speak to that? I'm not even sure if I'm on the right track with
You
that.
are.
But
One of the sort of side effects of climate change is when you increase temperatures, you also increase the water content of the atmosphere. And when you do that, you also accelerate what's called the hydrocycle, the cycle of water that is evaporated into the air, condenses into clouds, and comes back down to Earth. When you increase the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, you increase the intensity and the amount of water that comes down. So what you're seeing now is you're seeing, like Jacksonville in particular, our average rainfall isn't going to change much. And you look at the various climate models, and Jacksonville's kind of in a very weird sweet spot. But what is going to change, and what has already changed, is the intensity. You might still get 60 inches roughly of water every year in terms of rainfall, but when you get it, you might get 2 inches of it in an hour. Now, if your stormwater systems and your neighborhoods and your infrastructure is designed to take that, then you're fine.
then you're fine.
You just got a lot of water.
Well, here on the island, where Atlantic Beach is, within the last year, there were a couple of events where there was that strong dumping, and it flooded.
It flooded like crazy.
It flooded, especially right here, right
Right across the street from
here in Howell Park area.
Yes.
It flooded, and houses were affected. It was
Well, that is another thing that is happening. I hear a lot of people go, well, why do I care that ice is melting in glaciers, and why do I care that Greenland is losing gigatons of ice every year? Why does that matter? It matters because what that does is that affects the level of the seas. Greenland can affect sea level by upwards of about 20 feet, give or take. If Greenland melts completely, which it's not going to anytime real soon, but it is in the process of melting, it's raising sea level. The other thing...
Worldwide.
And what we've seen so far in terms of sea level rise is not so much the ice melting. That is contributing. The biggest factor is literally heat expansion. One of the big questions that scientists have been working out is, all right, the Earth is keeping more of its heat, but where is that heat going? And one of the big questions that's been answered partly with satellite data is that heat is ending up in the oceans, in the upper 2,000 feet of the ocean. You got to remember the average depth of the oceans is about a half a mile or so. It's quite deep. And you got to remember that most of the ocean we're not around. Most of it's way out, offshore. Well, that upper 2,000 feet of the ocean has warmed substantially. And of course, when things warm, they expand. And so it's about, I think, forgive me if I don't have my numbers exactly right, but about 2/3 of the sea level rise we've seen in the last 100 years has been thermal expansion. And the other third, give or take, has been ice melting. And what happens is you reach a certain point at which thermal expansion has kind of hit its kind of limit, and then when you trigger increased ice melting, then the ice melting becomes the bigger factor.
Gotcha, yeah.
So over the last 100 years, if you go to the NOAA website, they have tide data for Mayport going back 100 years. I think it was 1905 when they started keeping records.
And for listeners, Mayport
is right here in Jacksonville. It's just north of Atlantic Beach.
Right.
It's where the St. Johns River meets the ocean. There's a big Navy base there, and they've been collecting tide data there since before the Navy base in the town of Mayport. And so that's one of the oldest and most reliable sources of tidal information in this region, right here. So what they've been doing is they've been recording average tides, and you can go to the website and pull a chart, and it shows you the tides are rising very slowly, roughly in a straight line over the last 100 years, and it's been about a foot.
A foot
of rise.
Over 100 years.
Over about 100 years.
Okay.
If you also go to the NOAA website, poke around a little bit, you'll look at sea level rise, and you look at a map of the world, and you go, well, that's insane because it's rising in some areas, it's going down in some areas are worse than others. Why? And continents literally float on the mantle of the Earth. Kind of like large chunks of ice. They're frozen rock, basically. We don't think of them as moving, but in the last ice age, a huge amount of weight was put on the northern part of North America. A couple of kilometers of ice. Actually, New York was under several kilometers of ice, and one of the reasons why there's so much bedrock so close to the surface, which allows them to build big buildings, is because that ice age had literally ground the top of the soil off. The Great Lakes were formed by glaciers.
Yeah.
Well, that's all gone. And what's been happening is very slowly North America has been rebounding and righting itself now that those tons of ice are gone. And so the southeastern United States in particular is literally sinking. And that's because North America is literally tilting back to its state of equilibrium. And that happens very slowly. You're talking, millimeters over centuries. It's a small amount. But so you have North America is literally rewriting itself, so that's causing the southeast to sink a little bit. You have thermal expansion of the seas. You have increased ice melting, raising the seas. But now what's happening as a result of the Earth in the climate in its current form is sea level is actually rising faster now than it was in the last century. And so you look at sea level rise over the last 100 years, and it's about a foot. Well, if you look at the last 10 or 20 years, you're going to see something that looks like an exponential curve.
And that's the speed you're talking about.
That's the speed. It's accelerating.
And is that because of man-made factors?
Yes.
That's the
Well, it's some natural factors that are very small.
Right.
And
that have always been around.
That have always been around.
Right.
And there are some, because honestly, I mean, Florida, if you sort of want to, my background is in ecology, and one of the things that's very neat about Florida is when sea levels were about 200 feet higher, we had basically a set of islands down the central ridge of Florida, and it's known as the Lake Wales Ridge. And a lot of those areas have ancient sand dunes and plant communities on them that are found only in that area of Florida. They were isolated on islands. Natural selection took its course, and different species arose. Florida's also experienced much lower sea level. So where Jacksonville is, not so long ago, in fact, in terms of human history in the last 10,000 years, this was considerably farther inland. Jacksonville was inland back then.
So Atlantic Beach
wasn't the beach 20,000 years ago. It was inland.
Huh. Wow.
So in the sense, if you look at the global perspective and you hear the climate deniers go, oh, well, the Earth has done this. Well, yeah, it has. The problem is when you have a city in Jacksonville that has something at stake. Now, you were talking about the flooding you experienced here right
here, right
house.
out the front door.
Well, what's happening is the hydro period is accelerating, so you're getting more water faster.
Right.
In the tailwater condition, the ditches and drainage systems in Atlantic Beach were excavated somewhere around the 1940s or before that. We just did some work in this area, and we were looking at aerial photos. And you look, and a lot of the major drainage systems were put in prior to 1943.
Okay.
They worked. They've been working for the last 60, 70 years.
Right.
But in that time, sea level has risen almost a foot. So they're not as effective as they used to be. And they're not going to be as effective next year as they were this year.
So even that 1 foot in over a long period of time, I can almost hear people say, well, a foot in 100 years. Come on. What's the big deal?
Well, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you drive down Atlantic Boulevard, the Wonderwood Parkway, especially J. Turner Butler, I was driving down there the other day, notice the dead trees.
And is that from saltwater?
Saltwater intrusion. And that's what happens when your average high tides slowly migrate uphill. What happens is you have an ecological transition from a forested system that's primarily freshwater to a marsh system which is primarily saltwater, because trees can only withstand so much saltwater and regular inundation. So we had a recent, actually about a year ago, got a call from the city of Neptune Beach, from their engineer. And he's like, Adam, you got to come down here. I got a resident. He's really upset.
And Neptune Beach, again, for listeners who might not be familiar, it's a neighboring community to Atlantic Beach. It's literally right next door, across the road.
It's like 2 or 3 square miles. It's not big at all, but it's about a half mile south of where we are. And this resident was complaining that the city was flooding his property, and what he did was he went out when there was a king tide this time of year. And
king tide?
King tides are normally a reference for an exceptionally high tide.
Okay.
And that's influenced seasonally by the tilt of the Earth and by synchronization with the full moon. So usually in the spring and fall is when you get your highest tides.
Okay.
He went out with his cell phone at a high tide and a nor'easter when there was lots of water jammed up into these marsh systems, and he started taking some really amazing photographs of water everywhere. And then he turned around and blamed it on the city of Neptune Beach. Threatening litigation, and of course, no small town really wants to be sued and waste a lot of money on that. And I did some analysis, looked at where he lived, looked at the topography of where he was, looked at historic photos. Turned out the resident had been there since about 1984. What that resident, and he says, "Oh, you're killing my trees." Well, what this resident was really experiencing was a wetland, hardwood, freshwater forest slowly transitioning to a marsh. And what happens initially is you don't notice anything. Marsh grass starts sort of creeping in under the forest, and you go, well, that's kind of weird. I don't remember that being there. And then all of a sudden you have a nor'easter or a severe storm or a hurricane or something like that that really pushes these trees beyond their breaking point, and suddenly they die. And all of a sudden you go, wow, 5 big trees in my backyard just died.
What's going on here?
What's going on? Well, I looked at the NOAA website, looked at the sea tides and sea levels and all this. Turned out at our location since 1984, the average high tide has risen by 3.94 inches since 1984. Almost 4 inches. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're in Florida, 4 inches vertically on a flat terrain can mean that your ecosystems will shift by tens or hundreds of feet depending on your elevation.
Wow.
So 4 inches in average high tide increase is what's killing his trees. And this is part of a conversation we had before. He's like, well, what do I do? I said, there's really nothing you can do as an individual homeowner.
So he can't mitigate this?
No.
He can't put up a bulkhead?
Well, he could, but, it's just going to buy him some time. But, eventually that's going to overtake him. And as I explained to him and to the city of Neptune Beach, your house is probably fine based on the elevation of where it is, but you're going to lose your trees. And that is not the fault of the city. The city has not caused this or anything. This is a natural event that you are witnessing, and you've been here long enough to notice that difference. So the homeowner wasn't crazy. He was observing something very real. He just didn't understand the cause. And, of course, the easiest cause is a city that he can call and complain to. And as I told him, he says, well, what should I do? I said, well, let me put it to you this way. Your house is probably fine. When you pass and will this to your children, they might get a viable house. I said, but I strongly doubt your grandkids are going to get a house that can be lived in.
So this is really about the legacy that we create. So, and I hate to even go down. Well, I do want to go down this little rabbit hole because it's an interesting one. But why is this so controversial? Climate change. It raises, literally, it raises temperatures. People scream. People accuse all sorts of conspiracies. It comes into the politics. It has in the recent election. It'll continue. Is it economic? Is that the reason some people do it? Is it that people see it as government intruding on them? Is it that people just don't understand it? Or they didn't take science in school? Well, I mean, what is it?
Well, it's
Or are the scientists at fault here for something? Do the scientists sell it in a digestible way for us?
it's not easy to digest all the variables, and it's easy to look outside and go, well, the weather's the same as it was yesterday. Why should I care? Why should I, as a homeowner living on a marsh in Neptune Beach, care one way or the other? And the fact is, we don't have very good science education in this country. We don't. We haven't for a long time. So when you're talking about scientific issues, a lot of people take issue with that simply because it is scientific. It's fact-based. The reason why there's so much, in my opinion, the reason why there's so much resistance to it is it's forcing people to reevaluate things and change the way they get their energy, change the efficiency or the weight and size of their cars. It's forcing people to possibly change where they live.
And it has an impact on fossil fuels?
It does. Well,
the conversation does, because that comes into it, I would assume.
Well, one of the largest single industries in the world is the fossil fuel industry. And what we're talking about is basically, for the most part, suicide for them. And so you're talking about a lot of people employed in that industry. I mean, these are people, and they have jobs and
families
homes. And homes, and they run businesses, and they provide pipes, they provide equipment, they provide labor, they provide transportation. All of that is in play. And what I think the conversation has failed to do, what people in political situations tend to present choices as black and white, either or options. And one of the things actually that I learned very early on, actually from you, when we did the mock UN back in 7th grade, and I didn't fully appreciate it then, was when it was over, what was clear to me was that what you initially see is very black and white. Oh, gosh, how on earth could they possibly support that position? You realize that there is another side to it, and you realize that there are other interests at stake. And I think that the environmental community has been very bad at acknowledging that there's people here that really need to be taken care of one way or the other.
Human factors.
Human factors, and that is very real.
Yeah.
What I think people fail to appreciate is that it doesn't really, from an economic and my standard of living type of perspective, it doesn't really matter where those electrons come from or how they're produced. So whether they're produced at a coal plant or they're produced at a solar plant, in a way, doesn't matter. The reality is the alternative energy economy that is coming, regardless of our current president, it is coming. I was just on the phone with Duke Energy yesterday. I mean, their stuff is still going on. Their clean energy programs are not stopping. Alternative energy also creates jobs, also has economies of scale, also has businesses that are involved in that, also has economic opportunity involved with that. There's this notion that we're just going to sort of pack up the fossil fuel industry and all those people are going to be unemployed, and that's just not reality. Florida, as an example, is very rich in solar energy. We don't have a lot of wind. We don't have easy access to geothermal. We don't have a lot of other options. You're not going to see big wind farms in Florida. Just the resource isn't there.
Drive through Wyoming,
different story.
See 'em.
Drive through Western Texas, different story.
Right.
Different opportunities are there. And so sort of to say that alternative energy is all one thing or another is not an accurate representation. It's going to be different in different parts of the country. But the Florida is going to, one way or another, depend somewhat on fossil fuels, because when the sun isn't shining, or if it's been cloudy for a week, you're going to need something to keep the lights on.
You have a hurricane.
Or if you have a hurricane, how are you going to keep the lights on? Well, right now, the best solution we've got is natural gas. Now, eventually, we may have enough storage that we could store enough energy to power a city for a week. But right now, we don't have that. And so, the transition to clean energy is going to look like a lot of things.
Yeah.
It's going to look like some natural gas. It's going to look like some solar. It's going to look like some wind, and it's going to be different in different parts of the country.
And as you were saying that, Adam, one of the things that was coming to my mind was you have the global change, the climate change, occurs over a long period of time. It occurs, but it's occurring over a long period of time. And when we talk about helping people retool, and I think maybe sometimes it can be easy for me sitting in Atlantic Beach, Florida, thinking about somebody in the fossil fuel coal mine areas of our country and say, well, you got to retool. Okay, that's going to take time. Then you start getting into it's the education, it's the culture of an area. I mean, literally, when you've had families for generations in a particular, it's part of their blood. And so that's part of this conversation as well. How do you get them, retooled? And what's the best way? And how do you the only word that's coming to my mind is how do you sell it, but that sounds so manipulative, and I don't mean it that way at all. And then you raised, I thought, a very pertinent point that the environmental side of the discussion doesn't seem to articulate this very well or as effectively as it can, which is why we need people like you sitting at the table bringing these disparate issues together. And it's interesting, too, from a critical thinking standpoint. There are so many cognitive traps, and I'm hearing them. One is the narrow framing that's so much. You mentioned that with political discussions. And it's not just political discussions. It could, other things. But it's the either or, narrow, as opposed to either or and there's so many others. And then there's the confirmation bias, which is I'm only going to listen to what I believe, and everything else is suspect and really should not be believed. So I mean, the task is monumental, but it can't be. It seems like the results, the consequences, couldn't be any more significant.
Very significant.
The legacy that we leave. Again, probably in my lifetime, I'm going to see harder rains. Okay, I'm going to see that. I'm going to see the flooding. Am I going to see our beach, a couple of blocks from where we're sitting, go away? No, I'm not going to see that. However, the folks 50, 60, 100 years, and if they're going to see it.
They're going to see it.
They're going to see it. So let's do this as we tie it up. And I really appreciate you coming out of the swamps today to help us out with that. All right, this is real. Before I go there, I have to come up. This came to me. There are scientists that come up and say that counter scientists. And I know that we could go a whole episode on that. I'm going to make an assumption. They're scientists. Okay. So what are they reading? What are they seeing? And how are they drawing the conclusions that counter what you've presented in this 30 minutes?
They're human beings just like anybody else, and they're subject to the same frailties or misconceptions that anybody else is subject to. So while the data might say one thing, there's always going to be somebody with a PhD somewhere that's going to have a different opinion. Just because that opinion is different doesn't mean their perspective is valid. It just means it's different.
Okay. Let's finish with this. I always like to finish with a call to action. The old school teacher, it's like giving you homework, but not you. What can the listeners do? I mean, I'm not a scientist. Probably most of the people listening to this are not scientists. What can they do? What's the charge you would leave them with when it comes to this issue of climate change?
Reach out to your legislators, local, state, federal. Let them know that this is important. And it's not, from my perspective, it's not something that only affects Republicans. Or, I have people ask me, do you believe in this? It doesn't matter what I believe. It's happening.
Right.
And people need to start connecting the dots and reaching out to the legislators and saying, this is important to me.
So it's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue.
No.
It's not an independent issue, a libertarian issue. It
affects
issue.
Everybody.
It's an issue.
It's an issue. And the Clean Energy Plan is a good plan. And I hear people talking about energy rationing. What a load of baloney. I'm sorry. There's plenty of energy. We're not going to suddenly ask people to turn off the lights. They just might be powered by something different. Mm-hmm. And so people try to use scare tactics like, oh, well, solar isn't developed. Solar's been around a long time. And the reality, the problem that our current political deniers are faced with is now market forces are shifting to where it doesn't matter so much what the policy is. The Clean Energy Plan is happening. Energy companies are not investing in new coal. They're decommissioning their coal plants and they're cleaning them up.
And that's nationwide?
Nationwide. That's going on here in Jacksonville. That's going on all over the world, in fact. And that's partly regulatory driven. It's also partly market driven. That's a good thing. It creates jobs all in and of itself. I'm in that sector, and full disclosure, we derive a certain amount of our income from that sector. Mm-hmm. But those are good jobs. Those are not jobs you're going to export. Those are not low-paying jobs. Right. Those are highly skilled jobs. They're good jobs. And that will continue just as it has with our current power.
Somebody wants to learn more about it. You've excited them. Is there a website? I mean, we give in your website, onsiteec.com, but is there a clearinghouse where people could go to and you say, hey, if you're looking for information, here might be a spot to start.
ClimateReality.org.
ClimateReality.org.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's a place to start, and then there would be references from there.
There's references there. There are also, you can bring on speakers. I'm one of the speakers on that website. I can be called to action to speak in front of organizations or groups. Cool. Wow. There's also Al Gore's famous slideshow there, but they also have a lot of references there. And a lot of people like to make it like this had really something to do with Al Gore. He's just the cheerleader. He didn't invent this. He didn't make it up. It existed long before he was born. Okay, just he's just a guy.
Became a lightning rod.
He became a lightning rod. But what he did was he said, "Hey guys, listen up.
Pay attention."
And that's important.
Yeah. This is all important. And again, we attempt to do a lot within about 35 minutes with these episodes. And I appreciate you being here today, Adam. This is cool.
Thank you.
This is really, some 30, 35 years ago, I don't think we would have thought about this. No. Of course, none of this stuff existed that we're talking about here. Or at least, with the technology.
Right.
Climate change did exist back then.
It
That's
did.
Right. All right. So thank you, Adam. And once again, go to Adam's website, onsiteec, as in environmentalconsulting.com. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today. Without you, there is no Growth and Resilience Network. I thank you for sharing our podcast with family, friends, colleagues, and community leaders, which I think with this podcast is even more important. As Adam had said, contact local legislators, local commissioners, counselors, and talk to them. Again, it doesn't have to be a diatribe. Don't have to be yelling at people. It's having a conversation.
Yes.
It's a dialogue.
Let them know it's important.
Yes, and sometimes we've lost that ability to have a dialogue. We don't have to scream at people. Visit my website, stevepiscitelli.com, for more information about upcoming conversations on the GRN and about my programs and other resources for your personal growth and resilience. And while you're there, you can sign up for my email and newsletter list, and I promise never to spam you. So until we meet again, virtually or somewhere in person around this great nation, this is Steve Piscitelli from my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida, reminding all of us, choose well, live well, and be well. Bye-bye, folks.